Good afternoon. I'm Lipi Agarwal, she, her, joined with Jyotika Tomar as editors of one of the leading journal of NLSIU Bangalore Socio-Legal Review. Today, we are delighted to welcome Dr. Rahul Rao to this interview, and thank you for joining us. Dr. Rao is a prominent scholar whose work sits at the critical intersections of international relations, postcolonial and queer theory, and comparative political thought. He is currently a leader in international political thought at the University of St Andrews, having previously taught at the SOAS University of London and held a fellowship at University College, Oxford. A Rhodes Scholar, Dr. Rao earned his DPhil in International Relations from the University of Oxford and holds a BA LLB honours degree from the National Law School of India University. He is also the part of Radical Philosophy Editorial Collective and has contributed insights of commentary to the disorder of things. His work continues to shape and challenge how we think about global power, resistance, and belonging. As Socio-Legal Review, we seek to encourage interdisciplinary research that critically requires into the intersections between the law and the social sciences, especially in the South Asian context. Today, we are particularly excited to speak with Dr. Rao as part of our broader commitment to engaging with voices that foreground critical decolonial and queer perspectives. His scholarship speaks directly to themes explored by many of our previous guests and to SLR's own mandate of interrogating structures of power both within and beyond the law. Therefore, to begin with, Dr. Rao, could you please tell us a bit about the book and what drew you to write this book and how it came about to take the shape it eventually did, both intellectually and politically?
Sure. Thank you so much for this opportunity to talk about the book and for your engagement with it. Um, I suppose many people who've not been thinking about statues at all would have noticed that they had suddenly become, or appeared to suddenly become, sites of contention in 2020 at the height of the Black Lives Matter protests that began in the US and then spread to many parts of the world, when statues seemed to become a ground or a terrain for the expression or the contestation of racial and caste supremacy. Of course, for us in India, statues have been sites of political competition and antagonism for very much longer. Um, all that said, I started paying attention to statue protests in 2015 when a movement called Rhodes Must Fall erupted in Cape Town in South Africa. This was a protest against the continuing legacies of apartheid in South Africa more than 2 decades after the formal end of apartheid. The protesters took the statue of Cecil Rhodes, this arch Victorian settler colonist, which still sat on their campus, as a metaphor for the endurance of those legacies of apartheid. And what they were really protesting against was the whiteness of the curriculum, of the student and staff body, of the iconography and the built environment that they were surrounded by. So the reason I took notice of Rhodes Must Fall is because I had come to Oxford as a graduate student on a Rhodes Scholarship in 2001. Of course, anyone who applies for the scholarship knows that it is a bequest that Rhodes makes in his will, that the money for the scholarship is uh, drawn from his extractive racial capitalist endeavors in South Africa, in simple language, his plunder of the resources of Southern Africa. And so when you apply for a scholarship like that, I imagine everyone asks themselves the question of whether it is legitimate to benefit from the use of colonial plunder. Um, and of course, we tell ourselves a series of stories about why it might be okay to do that. Those of us who eventually take that money, we're going to do good things with it. We are going to defy the wishes of the founder, etc., etc. And I suppose when Rhodes Must Fall erupted in 2015, it struck me as a much more militant movement that was not resorting to those kinds of liberal, delusional stories about how bad money could be made good. Um, so it evoked in me a kind of shame and embarrassment and also excitement that suddenly there was this critical mass of people who were saying things out in the public sphere that had sort of rumbled along under the radar amongst the liberal sections of the Rhodes constituency for a long time. So that was the provocation for me to pay attention to these statue controversies. And I wrote a blog about this on the disorder of things. And, I was trying to think through all these issues, and I left it at that. And then in 2017, there was another spike of interest in statues around Confederate statues in the US, which have been long-running sites of contention because these are statues that glorify white supremacist figures in US history and have done for many decades, over a century. And this confrontation became quite a flashpoint because it occurred during the first Donald Trump administration. One of the statues slated for removal, a statue of Confederate General Robert E. Lee in Charlottesville, Virginia, became the site for a white supremacist Unite the Right rally and for anti-racist mobilizations against that. And these became violent. One of the white supremacists drove a car into the anti-racist protesters and killed a protester. And Trump infamously weighed in by saying, "Oh, there are very fine people on both sides, etc." So once again, statues became the ground on which some of the front lines of the culture wars were being drawn. And then, of course, the big 2020 moment. So it felt to me like statues were playing a role in contemporary public life, which perhaps they've played for a long time, but I suppose in my lifetime as a writer and thinker, it felt like a phenomenon and a moment that needed to be understood and thought through. So that's why I ended up writing this book. And that's broadly the period that I'm also interested in, I would say the last 10 years. Although there are various moments in the book when, of course, one has to historicize all of these developments and think through their logics in a much longer historical perspective. So you might say the book is a history of the present. It has a kind of longue durée imagination, but it is also concerned with the contemporary stakes of these questions.
Thank you for that. We're also curious about whether the fact that your primary training was in the law, and we're interested in this because we're also based out of a law school, whether that in any way shaped your approach towards thinking about these questions, and if you've noted legal responses to the controversies around statues in recent times, and whether the law also, either in its action or in its absence, also accounts for shifting perceptions around these statues culturally and politically and so on.
Yeah, thank you. Certainly my initial training was in law, but it now feels like quite a long time ago, and I never practiced as a lawyer. So I would say that I have always been interested in norms. Law is a kind of norm, but it's not obviously not the only kind of norm. It's an institutionalized norm. I've been interested in norms in the wider sense, social practices that sediment into ways of doing things that crystallize into moral oughts, right? So, so yes, I have been interested in the law and norms. I'm not there isn't a great deal of attention to law in the book, although your question does make me think or reminds me that there is actually a very considerable legal apparatus that surrounds statues and monuments and memorials. Um, some of this is about preservation and is about protection. And in the midst of these culture wars, the law was certainly deployed in that way, in a very forceful way. So, for example, in many southern states in the United States, there are preservation laws passed by predominantly Republican state governments that protect Confederate monuments and memorials and insulate them from any kind of challenge or recontextualization. And at the height of the COVID pandemic, 2021, the UK government also passed a similar law to protect statues and monuments and memorials from any kind of challenge. The policy was called Retain and Explain. And as that term suggests, the emphasis was on keeping things intact and perhaps, if there was political will, offering some kind of recontextualization of the history of whatever was being memorialized. Um, so that's one way in which the law was invoked and deployed. it was also deployed to punish people. And this was also a period in which penalties for any kind of statue desecration or defacement were ramped up in the UK, in Australia, and elsewhere. So the law was deployed primarily to protect and punish. Um, and perhaps that is what the law does in a lot of protest situations. Protect not the human rights of everybody to speech or expression, but protect symbols of power from any kind of challenge. So the law was very much deployed as an ideological instrument to keep power intact, to keep its unequal distribution, to keep the status quo intact.
Thank you for that, Doctor. You've also, like we did extensively mention Rhodes Scholarship and the Rhodes Must Fall movement. You yourself have been a Rhodes Scholar. So, how do you think, firstly, the Rhodes community has responded to the contemporary political movements like Rhodes Must Fall? And you've noted the need for a caste class survey of Indian Rhodes Scholar as well. Why do you think that has not been reckoned with so far?
Um, So first, on the broader question of the Rhodes community, I think it's a very diverse and divided community, and probably always has been on all the big moral and political questions that have confronted it. Certainly, many Rhodes scholars were involved in these mobilizations. Both those, importantly, those with connections to Southern Africa, South Africa, Zimbabwe, and other constituencies in the region, but also those from elsewhere. So I think there are many Rhodes scholars who were very much part of Rhodes Must Fall and were supportive of its ambitions. And equally, there were others who saw this as an unwarranted challenge of the founder, perhaps even as a form of hypocrisy, in the sense that here were people like me who were benefiting from the scholarship, but also criticizing the hand that fed us, so to speak. So I would say the Rhodes community was quite divided. One thing I would say is that my book is essentially, insofar as it talks about Rhodes and the scholarship and the community, it's talking about a state of affairs about 20 years ago when I was a Rhodes scholar. So in that sense, it's a memoir rather than a contemporary analysis of how that community has shifted. A lot has happened in the time since then, not least because of the efforts of Rhodes Must Fall. So the Rhodes Trust has felt compelled to respond to this kind of challenge, as have many institutions, both in the UK and in South Africa, particularly. Um, and you might say that those gestures have not gone far enough, but there is an ongoing conversation about the legacy of Rhodes, which is today, I think, talked about much more critically than it was when I was a Rhodes Scholar in residence at Oxford. And you can see that in different ways, in the way that the built environment of the Rhodes House in Oxford has changed somewhat, in the kinds of events that it hosts, in the increasing diversity of the pool of scholars, which brings us to your second question about the caste and class composition of the Indian Rhodes community. I would say this is an issue not just relevant to the Rhodes Scholarship, but to all scholarships, and one might say to all opportunities for graduate education in India. In the book, I make quite a blunt statement about um, the composition of the Rhodes constituency, and it's based on a news report rather than a formal study, which, to the best of my knowledge, doesn't really exist. We don't really have a very good sense of the caste and class composition of, say, Indian students who go abroad. I'm sure this work is being done, but it hasn't, to my mind, received the kind of attention and publicity that it should have. It's of course related to the broader questions about caste census, which, as you know, has been opposed by many dominant caste groups and voices. Um, but yes, I think we do need some kind of reckoning of how these opportunities are distributed. And to your question about why it hasn't happened yet, I think it's because we have tended to be satisfied, by we, I mean including progressives, with the question of entry into institutions. but not so much with the issue of what happens once students come into the institution and graduate from it. What kinds of career opportunities do they go to? Have we really measured how much of a boost students from different socioeconomic backgrounds get as a result of this educational experience? This work has been done in small scale ways, in pilot ways, in various places, but I don't think we have a big picture account of how graduate education shifts class and caste privilege.
Yes, thank you for that. Our next question is trying to situate India in the larger conversation around Rhodes Must Fall. So, at the risk of making a bit of a generalization, we think that we haven't really had an equivalent or our version of a movement of this sort where there has been a public reckoning or demands made for the removal of colonial era relics such as statues, nameplates, street signs, so on. But we also see that in the last 10 years, since the Modi government has been in power, we see a huge surge of demands for the removal of, um, for actually name changes, which are to do with names to do with Muslim rulers in particular. And that, interestingly, has been justified with the rhetoric of decolonization. So, how do you make sense of this paradox, which is a seeming indifference of sorts to the relics of the British colonial rule, while symbols of Muslim so-called invaders, as they are referred to by the Hindu right, um, there are frequent and very consistent demands for removing them instead and using the rhetoric of decolonization. And more broadly, what does that tell us about the current decolonial imagination, if we can call it that, in contemporary India as you see it?
You're right that there has never been a large scale movement demanding the toppling of colonial statues. There were demands of this kind in the first decade of the Indian Republic, around the 10th anniversary of independence, which was also the 100th anniversary of the revolt of 1857. There were demands in different states for removal of colonial statues, and Nehru was somewhat ambivalent, nuanced, you might say, about this question. He said, yes, well, we can remove offensive statues, we can preserve those of historical importance, and those that don't matter, whoever wants them can have them. He makes a statement in the Lok Sabha to this effect. Um, After he dies in 64, the removal of colonial statues proceeds in a small wave. And interestingly, they tend to be dumped in these places like Coronation Park in Delhi and Barakpur near Kolkata. So we get these statue graveyards many decades before this becomes a thing in Eastern Europe with former communist statues. But you're right, by and large, the attitude is one of benign neglect rather than commemoration or destruction or adoration. Why is that the case? My hunch is that quite early in the 20th century, so decades before independence actually happens, the fault lines in Indian politics shift from British versus Indian nationalist to fault lines that are internal to the body politic on the basis of caste, religion. And of course, one of the culminations of that is partition, but the other consequence and legacy of that is the intercaste conflict that we continue to witness to this day. So that might be one, I think, major reason why colonial statues are not flashpoints in the way that they have been in, say, settler colonies like South Africa or the United States, where the antagonism between settlers and natives and descendants of enslaved people is still very fresh because the legacies of those processes have continued to be felt in a very palpable way. Um, but you're right also that in recent years, particularly under the Modi regime, we are seeing the deployment of this term decolonization in quite spectacular ways to justify all kinds of things, whether it's large scale architectural visions like the Central Vista project and the so-called decolonization of Delhi. I've read articles that actually describe the project in those terms, or the revamping of Indian laws, which you'll be much more familiar with than I am, again justified in the name of decolonization, or the kind of Vedic age glorification as expressed through reference to ancient medicine science, the ways in which the university curriculum is being Hinduized. All of this is being hailed as a kind of decolonization of the Indian mind. Um, and it intrigues me that the stalwarts of the anti-colonial and post-colonial canon, Chinua Achebe, Frantz Fanon, Edward Said, um, um, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, are being hailed by ideologues of the Hindu right in this project of decolonizing. What tends to happen in the Indian context, as you've pointed out, is not the removal of colonial British symbols, but Muslim ones. So renaming Allahabad or the Mughal gardens or what have you. There are so many examples and they keep cropping up every day. The real audience for these gestures is Indian Muslims and minorities and oppressed castes. And these are ways of signaling to those audiences who's in charge, who owns the land, who is dominant. They are ways of ratifying that dominance, which is all too clear in practical material terms. So it is a case, I would say, of recolonization masquerading as decolonization. The decolonial rhetoric provides a kind of legitimation. Um, the right in many parts of the world is using left language as a way of legitimating itself. Right? That language became hegemonic over the second half of the 20th century. The right has understood that. And so part of how it builds support for its project is to deploy that common language, that apparently common language, to legitimate and stabilize a very different kind of project. So even in the West, the far right uses the language of decolonization to talk about defending itself from the invading immigrant hordes who are, when Brexit happened in the UK, it was celebrated by Brexiteers as a kind of anti-colonial gesture. Finally, the UK had sovereignty over its borders and could prevent unwanted outsiders from coming in, prevent colonialism by the European Union. So all of these terms are being deployed in what is essentially a fantasy of colonization by migrants, minorities, oppressed castes. In the West, the far right has this fear of the so-called great replacement of white people by the black and brown masses. Um, so I think that's what's going on. Decolonization is being co-opted, is being hollowed out. It's become so hegemonic that everyone appeals to it to justify their favored projects.
Thank you so much for that, Professor. It also brings about a lot of ideas such as like scholars such as Dr. Aisha Jalal. Um, Moving on to the same line, to global decolonial imaginations, your book itself is placed within a broader decolonial context, ranging from India to Ghana. It can be argued that till a couple of decades after even our independence, there was a widespread anti-colonial solidarity, like globally. Do you believe that this shared anti-colonial identity is somehow dead or dying now? And that, like, outside of academia and activist circles, our politics and public discourse no longer recognize these connections with the shared links with other post-colonial nations?
I think at the level of the state, certainly that imaginary has really shriveled up. Um, and I think that is not just a function of the BJP's rise to power. I think it was happening from before that. You could say from the 1990s with liberalization, um, India was shedding its allegiance to many of the key precepts of the non-aligned movement and the Third World Coalition before that. Um, it perhaps the embers of that project persist in projects like BRICS, but these are much more realist projects that bring together large global South states for particular strategic purposes as a counterbalance to Western geopolitical power. But if it survives at all, I think it survives in social movements. Um, in the organized left, but also in left social movements outside of that space, and now perhaps more importantly, outside the organized left. Um, I think an issue like Palestine is a very good index of where this spirit survives. So if you look for who in India today is concerned about what's going on in Palestine, not the state of Israel, but Palestine and Palestinian liberation, that's a very good marker of where this spirit survives, who is still animated by it, and what can still happen in its name. Is it restricted to academic and activist circles? Maybe those are the nuclei of those kinds of mobilizations and protests. Um, but I would like to think that there is a larger public that is attentive to these things. And I think it depends on where you're asking the question. So if you ask the question in Kashmir or in the Nagaland or the Northeast, you might get a very different answer to this issue of, you know, how to what extent is that spirit alive? And so the answer is the spirit is alive in the people who need it, the people who need solidarity, the people who need support, the people who are creating these alliances, who are invested in it. Because ultimately, the spirit survives when you need it for your own liberation, not just solidarity as something that we, the fortunate, provide to those who need it, but as something that is tied up in our own liberation, in our own emancipation. And then if you think of the question like that, then perhaps it's actually alive much in a much more widespread way in feminist and queer movements, in anti-caste movements. The moment these movements start to think about wider questions of how is our oppression sustained, what are the alliances that keep it in place, right? So think about the Indian government's connections with its reliance on Israeli weapons and technology in order to maintain its stranglehold over the Indian nation itself, whether that is the so-called anti-Maoist counterinsurgency or its occupation of Kashmir or its rule over different parts of the Northeast. Um, there's lots of interesting work on how this is reliant on weapons. India is a huge purchaser of Israeli weapons, and you can also think of surveillance technologies like Pegasus. Big story about how this Israeli developed surveillance was being used by governments all over the world, including India, to surveil the opposition. Um, Once those connections are made, then it becomes much clearer who needs solidarity with whom. And then the logic of solidarity is also much more obvious. It's not just about, you know, a relic of 1950s non-alignment. It's something living and present and something we need today.
Thank you. I think we were also thinking of this question precisely from the perspective of Palestine, and we've had these conversations about how drastically Indian foreign policy has changed towards Palestine and Israel. And like you said, I think closer to what we've seen, I think protest posters were a very good record of these kinds of solidarities across the third world and movements for decolonization. So thank you for that. Um, we the next question we want to bring to spaces that we occupy, we inhabit universities, and how similar to universities in the West, Indian universities have also become sites of contestations around statues. So we're thinking of JNU's Vivekanand statue and protests over busts of Savarkar at several places. So thinking of a few questions within this, we are wondering if this is some form of a student-led reconfiguration of iconographic memory as we understand it in India, and what you also make of shifts in generational memory around how public spaces and these kinds of physical symbols in the public are thought of and sort of reckoned with across generations, and whether there are some convergences or differences you read with how students in India and universities in India have sort of engaged with this question compared to our counterparts elsewhere.
The period in which I paid most attention to this was the anti-CAA protests. where students were, of course, at the forefront in institutions like Jamia to begin with, and then much more widely. And of course, what was really noticeable in those protests was the deployment of, stalwarts of the Indian political canon and symbols of Indian nationalism as a way of shaming the state. So I wrote an article called Nationalism Against the State, which was a way of trying to think through how the protesters, both students and non-student protesters, were using Indian anti-colonial icons, primarily Ambedkar, but also Phule, and also, um, um, not the sort of hegemonic figures, Gandhi, Nehru, Tagore, but a set of figures who have not received their due in the authorized history of the nation state in the first decades of the Republic. Um, I'm trying to think of the images that were most prominent because there was so much iconography also around this. Also, the deployment of the Constitution as a weapon with which to push the state in the directions it ought to be moving in. It was as if the nation was trying to shame the state into remembering the promises that it had betrayed, the promises that it had made to the nation that it had betrayed. And so I used this idea from David Lloyd, nationalism against the state. He develops it in a different context to try and understand what was happening during the CAA protests. Of course, this also has limits. So, sometimes I'm a bit skeptical of this love affair with the Constitution that we have, the assumption that it can solve all problems, and particularly in the context of places that do not wish to be governed by that Constitution. And I'm thinking of secessionist struggles in particular. Um, then the Constitution may not have all the answers. So there are limits to what a constitutional solution can deliver. That said, the Constitution is so capacious and in some respects so underutilized that it is certainly a very important tool in this struggle. But all of these things, I think, are quite distinctive to the Indian context. So perhaps in the United States, the Constitution has this, I think probably the US is a good comparison because there is a kind of constitutional patriotism there has been for a long time. We see appeals to, First Amendment rights, in the context of all of these struggles. So maybe there's some similarity there, but certainly not in the UK, where this idea of a constitution, there is a written constitution, but it's not written in any one place, and so it doesn't have the same kind of centrality and the same emotional purchase that constitutions have. The UK has also never had a revolution, so there isn't a kind of canon of thinkers to appeal to in the same way as there is in places like South Africa or India, for that matter. But I think there is also a very clear revision of the canon underway. And in the book, I try and explore this most closely with reference to Gandhi, who is being, whose statues actually have been under attack all over the world for very different reasons. Um, and in the chapter on Gandhi, I talk about the different sources of that attack, whether it's African student movements that are trying to decolonize the academy, or an Afro-pessimist discourse that sees the key racial fault line as not as not white versus everyone else, but black versus everyone else, where other people of color, for example, people like Gandhi, become as problematic as partners to white supremacy, to the globalization of the Dalit movement, whose critique is now global and no longer confined to India. And then, of course, there's a very different critique of Gandhi from the Hindu right. There always has been, right? It's the reason he was killed. And it continues to be echoed and revived and remembered, re-remembered on the anniversary of his assassination, when he's, of course, celebrated by those his followers, but also his Nathuram Godse is celebrated by the right, and Savarkar is held up. Um, Savarkar has now been elevated to a position of respectability in the Indian pantheon. His image displayed in the parliament, the statues and busts all over the place, the obeisance that political leaders pay to him, and the way in which his famous text, Essentials of Hindutva, has become a kind of constitution, an alternative constitution for the Hindu right. which whose ideas structure their imaginary and animate their rhetoric to this day. So there is a revision, there is a struggle over the canon, right? And I think in the center of all this is Ambedkar, whom everybody wants, including the Hindu right. I haven't yet read Anand Teltumbre's biography, which actually came out just after my book went to press. But I'm really intrigued by his treatment of Teltumbre because by Teltumbre's treatment of Ambedkar because he is, of course, one of his foremost interpreters, but he's also very critical of this appropriation of Ambedkar and the sort of hollowing out of Ambedkar's radicality by these different voices vying for Ambedkar. In that sense, Ambedkar is like the term decolonization, right? Which everybody wants a piece of, everyone claims to inhabit, everybody appeals to as a way of legitimating their respective projects. Um, so yeah,
Thank you so much for that, Professor, especially in respect to the iconoclasty about Dr. Ambedkar. In the same breath, if we flip the narrative to what the other side says, so what they defend, you defend detention of statues of colonial figures is by equating these with erasing history. They say that they are important markers of history, even if they are contested, they must remain. For example, the retain and explain policy in the UK. So, how do you imagine an anti-colonial pedagogy that may be used to respond to this history versus retaining history, as controversial as it may be?
it's a really important issue to address because this is probably the most common argument that those who are in favor of keeping problematic memorials in place made, that removing them would erase the history. And I think the most decisive responses have been offered in the US context, where many historians have pointed out that Confederate statues tended to be built not in the immediate aftermath of the US Civil War. As soon as the Civil War ended with the defeat of the South by the North, Southern states were too poor to go around building these huge monuments and memorials. They really come up in two waves, 50 years and 100 years after the Civil War, in periods when African Americans were making significant advances. So the statues are put up as part of a white supremacist backlash, as a way of saying, no, we're not going to let you advance. And we're going to remind you of who owns this place and who's the dominant figure. So many of these, the Southern Poverty Law Center did a census of the statues, dating them and demonstrating these two waves very clearly. So these statues are not they're not innocent historical markers. They're actually acts of propaganda. And when you think about it, perhaps all statues are this because it takes an enormous amount of money and material wherewithal to build a statue. So statue entrepreneurs tend to be, not always, but they tend to be people in some kind of position of power who can claim space and who can, who have the wherewithal to erect these symbols. And that means that they tend to be symbols of propaganda rather than history teaching. Um, in that sense, the struggles over the statues help us tell a much more honest history. And so I would say that preserving the memory of those struggles is in some ways more important than keeping the statue intact. So, for example, one of the most famous topplings in 2020 was the statue of Edward Colston, a slave trader in Bristol. And the city of Bristol is kind of plastered with memorializations to Colston because he was supposedly a big Victorian philanthropist. That statue was toppled in June 2020, and the toppled and defaced statue is now displayed in a museum, which I think tells a much more honest history about the figure than the original statue standing in Bristol, claiming that this person was a wise and virtuous son of Bristol, as it said before. So, toppling and defacement and preserving the memory of those things, I think, can end up telling a much more honest history about the very figure being commemorated than the sort of pristine figure of the statue. In other words, the toppling and the defacement is the anti-colonial pedagogy, and that is the thing that should be preserved. That said, I was also really struck while working on this book by the images of crowds of people bringing down these statues, anti-racist protesters bringing down these statues. And then it was very interesting to see what they did to them. So they often did to the statues what the figures represented by those statues did to other people. Statues of Confederate soldiers were strung up from lampposts, which reminds us about lynching. Statues of Columbus were beheaded and burnt. Statues of um, Colston were drowned, like enslaved people who were drowned when they were thrown overboard ships. So, in a way, we were being reminded of these historical processes of oppression um, in the act of protest itself.
Thank you for that. It's really interesting to think about how you think of sort of displaying a fuller life story of the statue in also telling people who come to sort of witness it about what happened after it was toppled. I think that was very interesting. I'm just going to ask a follow-up to that because this reminds me in many ways of Fanon's ideas of anti-colonial sort of movements and the idea of violence. So chapter 1 from his book, and how you sort of make sense of this is not a very fully formed question because it just came to my mind, but what also these movements tell us about 21st century sort of ideas of this kind of anti-colonial movements and resistance and the idea of violence in them, both from what they are sort of putting up and also the responses that are that is met with in terms of disdain and ideas of the fact that this is an undignified thing to do and so on.
Yeah, I think these ideas of civility are often a coded way of we have this sense that I think it presumes that the public sphere is a sphere in which we relate to each other as equals. And so if that were true, then these notions of civility and public decency would make a lot of sense. What they end up being is they end up being a coded way of preserving the status quo, because we know that marginalized groups do not enjoy the same uh, they don't have a share of the public sphere in the way that we presume. Um, and so it's necessary often to storm that public sphere, to trespass into it, to go into places where they don't belong. And that is often read as rudeness, incivility, unruly behavior, um, and punished by the law or by social disapproval. Um, even and this is and with student protests also a sort of suggestion that this is juvenile behavior, that these are students who haven't understood what they've really come to university for. And we hear this kind of language a lot from university administrators all over the world, I think, that students ought to be sitting in class studying. It also betrays a different vision of what the university is for, what university education is for, which becomes less about preparing people for citizenship and much more instrumental, much more about learning a set of technical knowledges and skills that can be deployed in the market to earn a living, which of course is also very important, but ends up producing docile model capitalist subjects rather than active and engaged citizens who might ask difficult questions. Um, of course, Fanon was writing in a settler colonial context where this unruliness manifested in violence. Fanon is often read as justifying violence. And I think David Macy, one of his most astute biographers, makes this really interesting point. He says, it's meaningless to say, is he for or against violence? What he is a theorist of violence. And what he's arguing in that first chapter and in The Wretched of the Earth as a whole is that violence is so all-pervasive in the settler colony. It is so inescapable because every interaction involves it in some way from the perspective of the native, that the use of violence is not a choice. It is a compulsion that is thrust on the native if he or she or they are to transform their situation in any way. And I think that's to me, a more interesting and useful way to think through Fanon and his position on violence than the usual, is he for it, is he against it? We juxtapose him with Gandhi and sort of think of them as contrasts. But perhaps what we need to think about is that they're inhabiting very different colonial situations in which the tools and techniques have to be very different. The tools of anti-colonialism have to be very different.
Yeah, thank you. That was very interesting to think through. Our next question is about the idea of settler colonialism in the 21st century. So, though your book engages with colonialisms that have so-called ended, so those of the previous few centuries, we think that this is also a very important question to ask, particularly in context of Israel. And we see that a very large part of its genocidal project is the destruction of Palestinian public spaces, monuments, histories, and conceptually there have been terms used for this in terms of urbicide and scholasticide, the destruction of its universities. And so, is there some thing to be said about constraints that are posed by settler colonial projects on dramatic gestures such as statue toppling, and how? I mean, so what is this project about? If you can sort of help us make sense of it, and yeah, yeah, sorry, yes,
Yeah,
that's
no,
my
that's
question.
a great question.
Mhm.
Um, this business of ending is very interesting and important. How do we know whether colonialism has ended? You know, Saidiya Hartman uses this term afterlives quite a lot in her work to think about whether it has ended, to question the notion of endings. So yes, we have independence. African political theorists often call it flag independence. They use that term a lot to remind us that all that happened was you got a new flag or a new airline or the transfer of power is a shallow thing in many contexts. And terms like neocolonialism were coined to show how, despite this appearance of ending, many things stayed the same, economic imperialism and so on and so forth. So I would question the notion of ending even in places where there have been formal proclamations of independence or emancipation. Um, and this matters in all the contexts I've written about. It matters in South Africa, where the students were saying, yes, apartheid ended formally in 1994, but the legacies of it are still with us. It matters in the United States, where, yes, there was an Emancipation Proclamation, but the afterlives of slavery are still felt in the institutional racism of police, of healthcare, of universities, of all of the institutions of public life. And in the Indian context, in terms of caste, of course, it doesn't even need saying. We have the abolition of untouchability, but the caste system persists, untouchability persists. So the end is nowhere in sight. And in many ways, these struggles are struggles to bring about an end that has not yet happened. But all that said, there is something distinctive about settler colonialism, which makes it different from colonialism simpliciter, colonialism without the qualification. That difference has usually been glossed through Patrick Wolf's definition. Settler colonialism is the elimination of the native, uh, which is distinct from colonialism as the exploitation of the native. So colonialism exploits the native for their labor, but settler colonialism seeks to eliminate the native in order to access land and resources and to be able to found the settler colonial nation in which the settler becomes the new native. Now, these are heuristic distinctions. Most situations probably involve elements of both exploitation and elimination, but the balance between these things tends to be different in different situations. I think what makes the Israel-Palestine case distinctive is that this process of elimination is unfolding before our eyes. It's happening in front of us. It is not a process that is in the past where our prospects for action, are more limited. it's happening in real time. It's happening, on our TV screens, on our digital devices. And that is why I think there is this enormous global investment on the part of anti-colonialists to stop it, to throw sand in the wheels of the machine that keeps it happening. Um, I don't know what to say about it. Like it's such an overwhelming phenomenon, and we're we're sitting here now in the aftermath of a so-called ceasefire that was supposed to have paused some of this, and actually it continues even more relentlessly because now it feels as if the collective opposition has also become tired, exhausted by not just by the Israeli state, but by the support given to it by this new US state from January onwards. So the stakes, I think, are very, very high and very clear. Um, yeah, I'm, I might have more to say when we come to edit this, but yeah, it's a big question. But feel free to ask a follow-up if you think if there were bits of the question that maybe I didn't address. Or
No, I think we'll come back to this perhaps later.
okay,
Yeah,
yeah.
we move on to his next set of questions for now. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Professor. Moving on to like themes of subaltern counterpublics, because that is also, we believe, a very critical theme to address when we talk about decolonization, especially through statues and politicization of it. When we speak of counterpublics and assertions over public space, Mayawati's wide-scale architectural projects come to our mind, and so does the deep discomfort and criticism this generated from the upper caste groups, who often spoke of this as a drain of public money. So, how do you make sense of all of this? Do you believe that this adds a fresh dimension to the anti-colonial movements situated around public iconography, especially statues, but over and beyond?
I think Dalit statue building is a really important phenomenon and an instance of how statue building might be emancipatory because it is a phenomenon in which the building of a statue of Ambedkar is a way of claiming space, often in contexts where Dalit communities have been denied space, denied access to public land. It's a way of asserting dignity, it's a way of asserting pride, and it's a way of reminding Savarna audiences of the debt that they have to Ambedkar as well as founder of the Indian Constitution. We know that most of these images of Ambedkar show him holding the book, right, the Constitution. Um, what Mayawati does is to turbocharge this process, to carry it out on an exponentially grander scale during her brief tenures as Chief Minister of UP. Um, And for the first time, possibly in the history of India, you see the memorialization of the Dalit presence on a scale that can rival the Mughals and Latians and all of these previous empires. Many scholars who studied these forms of memorialization have noted, and I agree, that the grandeur of these projects was a kind of future proofing, a kind of insurance against their possible vandalization, which we know happens all too often, right? Ambedkar statues are desecrated, are caged, are brought down. So the sheer grandeur of these memorials, I'm thinking particularly of the Lucknow memorials, are a way of safeguarding them against this possible future in, when she falls from power, when the BSP loses power. Um, and as you note, there's been a lot of Savarna criticism of this. A lot of that criticism is quite hypocritical because Savarna groups have spent lavish amounts of money on building their own statues and memorials. We can see this in the statues of the Hindu right, and in all kinds of grandiose projects of Hindu revivalism. But that said, the criticism of Mayawati statue building has also come from people like Teltumde, who whose criticism is very different from the Savarna criticism of this statue building. Teltumde points out he says, yes, the Savarna criticism of her is hypocritical because she has only done what all other Indian politicians have done. But he argues that she could have used these symbols um, as a way of redistributing materially to Dalit communities. Instead, what her symbolism does is it catapults a small section of the Dalit community into power in alliance with Brahmins. And as we know, she's made a series of opportunistic alliances with different communities to come to power in UP. So Teltumbres is a very different critique of the failure of this kind of symbolic politics to translate into material gains, and of the way in which this becomes just like any other symbolic politics, rather than one that has any kind of emancipatory promise. And this is related to his broader critique of how Ambedkar has been opportunistically instrumentalized, not only by Dalit elites, but also by Dalit elites. So I suppose all this to say that there is a legitimate and an illegitimate critique of Mayawati, and I think it's really important how we, how we situate those critiques and yeah.
Thank you. And continuing to think from the last question, we're also curious about how you think of the differences in more organic, sort of local celebrations or just everyday forms of living around these so Dalit statues like that of Ambedkar, the Phules, others. I'm thinking particularly about the most common Ambedkar statue of him holding the Constitution. And so the differences between those forms of sort of re- engaging with or responding to or just living around these public spaces and so state-led projects such as that of Mayawati and how we think of these as different things.
I think there is probably quite a big difference between those different projects. Nicholas Jowl has a really great paper on this grassroots Ambedkar statue building in UP, in the 19 well, from the 1960s onwards, these statues were being built, and it reaches a high point when the BSP comes to power. But he argues that many of these early Ambedkar statue building projects were very humble grassroots initiatives where first, within the village or the town, the Dalit community had to get itself organized. So you had these mobilization committees forming because the task of building a statue required raising money, it required finding land, it required collective mobilization and unity. And in some ways, that is really the most important thing, more important than the artifact that results from that endeavor. He also talks about how inaugurating these statues, often the local Dalit community would invite a VIP, right? Typically a Dalit government servant or politician. And so that kind of gesture helps them to build alliances with people in the state apparatus, which then becomes useful later on for all kinds of practical material purposes. So that is what a grassroots Ambedkarite mobilization around statues looks like. And I would suggest that that can often leave a longer legacy in terms of community building, in terms of mobilization, in terms of organization, than the top-down state initiatives, which are very reliant on having a Dalit party in power in the state government and in the capital. Those kinds of initiatives can often be reversed by a hostile rival government that comes to power. I mean, the US right now is a classic example of that kind of reversal of policy and so on and so forth. Perhaps in the Indian context, we don't quite see that kind of dramatic reversal. And as I was saying earlier, Mayawati is probably aware of that danger and therefore does this on an immense scale that is harder to dismantle. But in some ways, I think that leaves less of a legacy of grassroots mobilization and unity than the more organic bottom-up approach. But these things are connected because the BSP comes to power at the state level only as a result of those grassroots mobilizations. So there's also a connection between those two projects that we can't ignore.
Yeah, that was very insightful, Professor. On a similar line, again flipping the narrative to the other side, You argue that in a modern day form of personalization, upper caste Hindus responded to Dalit claims of the public sphere by building Hindu religious statues at a fast pace and in large numbers. Symbols of nationalist figures like Sardar Patel also became a part of this expansive project of statue building. How do you think then the capital and the Hindu right interact in the statue building project in terms of its show of strength, its wealth, and a projection of the might of the great Hindu nation, and just the romanticization of the Hindu or the Vedic nation that we did talk about? So, what is this imagination built at the cost of, in your opinion?
I think the most theoretically sophisticated answer to that question has been given by Kajri Jain in a book called Gods in the Time of Democracy, which anybody interested in monumental statue building in India should read. Um, she tells a kind of the long 20th century story of statue building in India, and it sort of begins in the late 19th century with British colonial governmentality beginning to govern the body politic in terms of communities, conducting a census, the beginnings of provincial legislative assemblies and elections. So communities become very conscious of themselves as communities and of the politics of number. Um, and she talks about how communities often consolidated themselves around icons. She calls this phenomenon iconopraxis. Why does it happen? It happens because one of the important movements around this time is temple entry movements by subordinate castes and Dalits, oppressed castes, who are denied entry into Hindu temples. And she argues that the Hindu response to these demands was not to open up temples, but to bring the icon out of the temple into processions. And this is how you get Ganapati Utsav in Maharashtra and Durga Puja in Bengal. These processions, the icon being taken out in procession, becomes a way of marking territory for the community. It becomes a way of consolidating a public around that particular icon. Um, and of course, Dalits do this as well. They also take out icons in procession, but the Dalit form of iconopraxis that becomes more well known is the building of Ambedkar statues, which takes off in subsequent decades. But then she argues in the 1980s and 90s, you get a different kind of phenomenon. And this is tied to the moment of liberalization, when industries like cement and automobiles and road building are taking off in a big way. Real estate, construction, there's a construction boom related to the cement industry, of course. And she argues that iconic statue building picks up in this moment, interestingly, as a way of marking out new space for peri-urban and urban development. So any of us who's driven out of an Indian city into peri-urban areas will notice these forms of peri-urban development where you'll often see a huge statue on the side of a highway, right? She argues that these are often early signs of real estate encroachment into common lands, a way of claiming land for building and for real estate development. So the statue becomes a way of a sort of means towards a land grab, if you like. And we see this in many places and many situations. So this is one moment, I think, when capital, the ascent of the Hindu right, the desire for appropriation of land, neoliberal capitalism is hungry for those kinds of resources, and the statue becomes a way of occupying that land in preparation for some kind of big capitalist urban project. Um, it's a much more sophisticated argument than I can do justice to in a few sentences, but I think those conjoined processes in the late 80s and early 90s are the moment to look at for an account of how the Hindu right, neoliberal capital are beginning to come together. Remember, this is also the moment of the Mandal mobilizations, the movement for the Ram Mandir in Ayodhya, but also the movement against the Mandal Commission expansion of reservation for OBCs. So all of this is happening around the same time. And it's also the moment in which the Hindu right is building these icons and symbols on an ever more gigantic scale. in response to Dalit community mobilization. And I argue in the book that one culmination of this is the Statue of Unity, which is the tallest statue in the world at this point in time, and is built on the site of the Narmada Dam. The dam, of course, in all Indian readers will know, has been the site of an iconic struggle around the appropriation of land, water, resources in the Narmada Valley, um, which have displaced, the numbers vary depending on whose reckoning you look at. I've seen figures that go from 250,000 to 1 million people, um, primarily Adivasis or disproportionately Adivasis. And the statue, built on the site of what were the project offices of the Narmada Dam, has displaced still more people, particularly from the Tadwi community. Um, And this statue brings together both the ambitions of the Hindu right, the lionization of Sardar Patel as, the strong man, the Iron Man of India who welded together the Indian nation. Modi models himself on Patel as a kind of Chote Sardar, his followers call him. But so it expresses the sort of nation building, muscular nation building, nationalistic ambitions of the Hindu right, but also the capitalistic ambitions of the Hindu right. Because if you think about it, what is the Narmada Dam? It is a way of extracting resources from the Narmada Valley and distributing those resources, which formerly were enjoyed by people who lived in the valley, to agro-capitalists in different parts of Gujarat, Madhya Pradesh, Maharashtra, and to the urban areas of these states. I'm simplifying a much more complex story, but it is a gigantic project of appropriation. And the statue is a kind of triumphant capstone on this very long-running project of extractive capitalism. Um, as a footnote, I would add that the statue also cost a huge amount of money, about 300 million pounds. I've lived in the UK for half my life now, so I think in pounds, but and some of that money was actually taken from the corporate social responsibility budgets of public sector companies, which is an absolute scandal if you think about it, because it's not at all clear what social responsibility this serves beyond simply lionizing uh, the favored icons of the Hindu right.
Thank you so much for that. For our last set of questions, we want to think through these movements that we find ourselves in and your ideas, to think of what we can do in the ways ahead. Um, so we know that statues are both sort of erected and brought down as forms of resistance, as your work has also showed. And however, of course, we know that their very existence means that they are completely unavoidable and must be reckoned with. But if there's something in the very medium of statues and sort of these physical embodiments that is inherently hierarchical, and what forms of resistance could look like in other ways. So other kinds of iconography, such as digital mediums of performance, or something else that you have something in mind.
Yeah, that's some people think that the statue form is inherently problematic, that there is something inherently limiting, colonizing almost, by the way the statue freezes in time a person, uh, and not just a person, but freezes the act of honoring a person in time. And that can be problematic because our evaluation of that person may shift in response to changing social mores, in response to the changing balance of forces in society. Our understanding of right and wrong might shift. Our evaluation of a figure's actions might change. But the statue freezes this act of honoring the person in time, insulates the person from critique, puts them up on a pedestal. So some people argue that the statue is, as a form, as a medium, is inherently problematic because it freezes our attitudes towards something or someone in time. Um, I think that's true, but I think there are ways in which we have displayed statues that can change that view. So, for example, we were talking earlier about actions against statues, right? Defacement, um, attacks, graffiti, etc. And in some ways, all of these show how those attitudes are changing and preserving those marks on the history of the statue, preserving our shifting attitudes towards the statue can actually end up telling a changing story. That doesn't always happen because authorities are usually very anxious to preserve the statue as it is, rather than to allow these marks of shifting attitudes to be displayed. It takes a lot of work to convince those authorities to allow those marks to be displayed. Many people talk about contextualization as a way of squaring this circle. So yes, our attitude towards the statue may change, and that's why it's often useful to recontextualize the statue. I think there's some value in that, but there are also limits to what recontextualization can do aesthetically. Think about many of these statues are huge, grandiose structures built on massive plinths, elevated high up. The very architecture of the object is intended to honor it. What is a small plaque with size 12 font writing at the bottom going to do to disrupt that aesthetics? Many people may not even see it. Um, so I think there are limits to what recontextualization can do. What I think is really interesting is the new forms of memorialization that we're beginning to see, in which the human figure is not very central. If you think about many of the monuments and memorials to mass atrocities, often the human figure is dispensed with completely because that is the very thing that is destroyed by those atrocities. So when I think about some of the Holocaust memorials, not the big monumental ones, but in many European cities, there are these stumbling stones in the pavement, little brass, they're not even plaques, they're like pavement stones made out of brass outside the house from which Jews were taken to concentration camps, marking the name of the person, the date. Um, and they're called stumbling stones because you don't see them. You literally stumble over them when you're walking down the street. Or I went a few years ago to a park in Buenos Aires. Argentina has had this period of military dictatorship when people were disappeared. And they have very innovative ways of memorializing the disappeared. Um, Not necessarily through figurative sculpture, but through walls of names, through memorial parks that tell the history of the country through symbols, in ways that are very haunting. And what is interesting here is that in the context of the disappeared, the body is the very thing that is not there. The person is taken away. You don't even know they've been taken away. You don't know why. You don't know when they died, etc. So how do you memorialize a body that is not there? Um, Again, the use of non-figurative ways of memorializing, I think, is very, very powerful. So I'm drawn to these other ways of memorializing things. And then, of course, you mentioned the digital. One of the most iconic protests during the 2020 BLM protests in the US against Confederate statues, before the statues in Richmond, Virginia were taken down, um, there were these giant light projections of George Floyd's face, of BLM logos onto the statues. So the statue became a kind of canvas on which a news story was told. So that I think is a very powerful, and when you think about it, it doesn't require that much by way of material infrastructure. Of course, it requires a light projection device, and I, d- I should maybe it does require a huge amount of planning, but in terms of capital, perhaps these are ways of memorializing that are not as capital intensive as the statue itself. Um, and that may be more powerful and more effective for it. So there's an infinite range of answers to your question, and actually that's one of the exciting things about the project is how we still have a need for memorializing, but how do we do it? If the statue isn't the right medium, are there other ways in which we can do that?
Thank you for that, Professor. You mentioned that the centrality of human figure is often not the only way of such resistance. In the same breath, the last question is that how can the conversation then around statues be extended to other tangible anti-colonial forms of action that are required? Like, do you think the conversation around statues has pushed a needle somewhere else, which is very much needed. For instance, where we think about the toppling of Lord Nelson's statue in Barbados, and that eventually how it led to the displacement of the colonial rule, but through a lot of dominoes in the middle, if that's the word. So, how does that push a conversation somewhere else?
That's a great example of a statue protest that was part of a larger set of demands. Almost all the statue protests by anti-colonial, anti-racist, anti-apartheid left statue protests that I'm aware of were using the statue as a symbol or a metaphor or a doorway, a portal into a larger conversation about structural racism. So whether it was Rhodes Must Fall, thinking about the legacies of apartheid in the academy, or Black Lives Matter, thinking about institutional racism of the police, or the fact that a lot of these protests took place at the height of COVID, which was experienced by many of us as a pandemic that disproportionately affected certain racial and caste groups, um, all of these protests were actually using the statues as a way into a larger, deeper conversation about material institutional racism and casteism. The problem is that we often got hung up on the statue. We got stuck on the statue, on the symbol, on the metaphor, as if answering the question, should it stand, should it fall, was the end of the story. It was not. The protesters were trying to use this as a way of having those deeper conversations. Sometimes the deeper conversations happened, sometimes they didn't. So, an example would be in South Africa, the Rhodes statue was taken away by the university within 1 month. And the university then effectively said to the protesters, we've given you what you want, go back home. So it was used to demobilize, to shut down, to co-opt. There's a really great article by Thuli Gamedze in Radical Philosophy about that phenomenon. And conversely, in many other places, the statues were not taken down. The issue remains alive. And in a sense, the fact that it remains alive means that people are still talking about these issues and pushing for change in different ways. That's not to say the South African protests failed. They succeeded in all kinds of other ways. But I think the key point I'm trying to make is that link between the statue and the material stakes is really significant, important, and has to be maintained in order for us to push the needle, as you say, in progressive directions.
Right. Thank you very much for that. Just before we conclude, actually, I have a question about when a South Asian copy of the book will hopefully come out.
Yeah. So when I looked really hard for a South Asian publisher. We actually approached 5 or 6 for a separate India edition, and none of them were interested in 2020. So there is actually no separate South Asian edition. But I have a discount code which can give you 20% off the book's price. So, and that's valid for a year. So if you buy directly from Pluto Press and you use the code RAW20, it gives you a 20% discount off the hardback. There will be a paperback edition in, I think, about a year, which will be much cheaper than the hardback. So hopefully that will make the book more accessible in India. But yeah, this is a real sore point on my side because it's a book that I think I hope will have a large Indian audience. Um, so it would be a shame if people in India couldn't access it.